So, in the early days of the United States, you have this protest by a handful of farmers over a whiskey tax, right? And it spirals into this huge national crisis. But what if that wasn't an accident? What if the whole thing was a calculated test of power, designed specifically to forge the authority of the brand new federal government? Well, that's exactly the story we're getting into today.
It really all boils down to this one fundamental question. Okay, you've just started a country. You've got a constitution, you've got a president. It all looks good on paper. But how do you actually prove you're in charge? Especially when you got people out on the frontier, hundreds of miles away, who are pretty used to just making their own rules.
Yeah, this was never just a simple fight over taxes. As our source material puts it so well, this was a volatile intersection of frontier autonomy and nascent federal authority. You're talking about a clash between two completely different visions for what America was supposed to be.
And you can see these two sides pretty clearly here. On one side, you have frontier autonomy. These are folks who are all about self-governance, local loyalties, and they have this deep-seated resistance to anyone from far away telling them what to do. Then on the other side, you've got this nascent federal authority, this new central government that desperately needed to create national unity and prove it wasn't just some idea, but a real power. These two forces were absolutely on a collision course.
So, how did the federal government decide to flex its muscles? This is where it gets really interesting. The thinking here is that Treasury officials, with Alexander Hamilton leading the charge, didn't just want to collect a tax. They chose to weaponize it, using this tax on whiskey as a tool to cement their power.
And that brings us to this key concept: weaponized tax enforcement. See, for these farmers out on the frontier, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was basically a form of currency. So taxing it, that was a deliberately provocative move. The government knew it would start a fight, and that was exactly the point. The goal wasn't just cash, it was to project power and force people to comply. And this whole manufactured confrontation? It worked perfectly. A small, localized protest was intentionally blown up into a massive national crisis. It was framed as the ultimate test of executive force, a challenge that the new government was absolutely determined to win no matter what.
You can actually see the playbook right here. It all starts with a local protest. That is then met with super aggressive enforcement from the Treasury. This intentional escalation then gives the government the justification it needs for huge military mobilization. And the final step? A federal precedent gets set in stone. The government has the power to enforce its laws, and it will use force if it has to.
And the year this all goes down is 1794. This is the moment. This is when the theoretical power written down in the Constitution becomes a very, very physical reality. Out there in western Pennsylvania, the new federal government basically drew a line in the sand.
And the result of all this wasn't just some temporary thing. As our source concludes, this event permanently reshaped the early national landscape. The entire relationship between the states, the frontier, and the central government was changed forever. To really see how, let's just look at the before and after.
Before 1794, federal authority was, mostly an untested idea. Sure, the Constitution said the government had power, but could it actually enforce its laws against organized resistance, especially so far from the capital? Honestly, nobody really knew the answer to that.
But after 1794, there was an answer. And that answer showed up in the form of an army of almost 13,000 men, led, by the way, by the president himself. Federal law was not a suggestion. The question of power was answered with an overwhelming show of force. The days of questioning if the federal government was supreme were officially over.
So, to put it all together, the big takeaway here is this. The 1794 mobilization wasn't some kind of accident or overreaction. It was a cold, calculated strategy. It used tax enforcement as its chosen weapon. And you know what? It worked. It successfully cemented the power of the central government and set a lasting precedent for executive authority that we still live with today.
Think about it. This one event from over 200 years ago basically wrote the playbook for how the U.S. government responds when its authority is challenged. Which kind of leads us to a final question to chew on. When we see these debates today about federal versus state power, where do we still see the echoes of 1794?